The locals didn't call it Clearwater Hot Springs. That was the name on brochures, on a sun-faded sign at the trailhead, on the little wooden map kiosk that always smelled faintly of pine sap and cheap varnish. The locals called it the Breathers, because the ground there didn't just steam, it exhaled. On cold mornings, the fog rose in slow pulses from cracks in rock, from mossy seams, from places where the earth looked solid until it wasn't. It was the kind of place that could make a person feel small in a good way, or small in a very bad way. Depends what you brought with you. Curiosity, maybe, or a secret. Evan Rook brought a backpack, a phone with a dying battery, and the kind of confidence that's almost charming until it becomes evidence later. He'd been hiking since college. The weekends are for oxygen type. The type who could talk about boot tread like it was a personality trait. He wasn't reckless in the cinematic way. He didn't leap across cliffs with a grin. He was the steady kind of outdoorsman, the one who always packed a headlamp even if he swore he'd be back before dark. That detail mattered, because when he vanished near the hot springs, the first thing people said was that he must have slipped, must have underestimated the terrain, must have done something dumb. As if the woods are always neutral and humans are always the problem. But the Clearwater area had its own rules. A trail could look dry and safe, and then, 3 steps later, your boot would sink into ground that had been softened for decades by heat and mineral water moving underneath like a slow animal. A little creek could be ankle deep and friendly until you followed it far enough and found the place where it was born from the rock. Too warm, too loud, too alive. Evan arrived on a gray morning when the mountains looked like they were wearing scarves. He parked in the trailhead lot beside a pair of dusty pickup trucks and one rental SUV with a National Park Adventure sticker peeling at the corner. He stepped out, stretched his shoulders, and stood still for a second, listening. He liked that part. Before the hike begins, when your mind is still full of noise but the forest doesn't care and keeps doing its own slow breathing. He took a photo of the trail map like he always did, more habit than need. Then he started up, and the first mile was easy. Pine, fir, a few early wildflowers, the faint chatter of water somewhere off to the right, the kind of trail that makes you feel like you're in control. He passed a couple heading down, their cheeks pink from steam, the woman's hair damp and curled at her neck. They gave him that satisfied grin people get when they found something nice and want to pretend it's a secret. Evan nodded, smiled, and kept moving. He wasn't going to the main pools, not the ones with stone steps and a worn log bench where strangers chatted like old friends. Evan had read online about a lesser used route, a spur trail that climbed above the hot springs and looped around a ridge. You could still dip in warm water, the post claimed, but you had to work for it. The post also mentioned a small viewpoint where you could watch the steam rise through the trees like a hidden city. Evan loved that kind of thing. The extra effort, the feeling of earning a view. The spur trail wasn't on the official map. It wasn't exactly hidden either. It was one of those unofficial paths that exist because enough people keep walking the same line through the woods until the woods surrender and stop growing there. The entrance was subtle. 2 rocks stacked like somebody's idea of a sign. A narrow opening between huckleberry bushes, a strip of dirt that looked a shade darker than the forest floor around it. Evan hesitated. Not long. Just long enough to take a sip of water, adjust the straps of his pack, checked the sky. Then he turned onto the spur. Within minutes, the air changed. Not colder, not warmer, just different. It carried the mineral smell now, sulfur and wet stone, like a struck match that had been left in rainwater. The forest thinned. The undergrowth turned from soft fern to tougher, scratchier plants, and the ground under Evan's boots began to feel hollow. Not literally, not a dramatic sinkhole thing, but a subtle softness that made each step require more attention. He was careful. He followed the path as it climbed. He checked for blazes or ribbons and found none. He took out his phone and opened his trail app, then frowned when the dot drifted like a lazy lie. The canyon walls and tree cover made GPS unreliable here. He pocketed it again, annoyed but not worried. Evan had navigated without a dot before. He reached a fork where the path split around a fallen tree. One side looked clearer, the other looked older, a faint line disappearing toward thicker steam. Evan chose the older line. He didn't know that choice would become the moment everyone argued about later. Search and rescue would say the clearer path would have led him back toward the ridge, toward safer ground. The older line dipped closer to the geothermal basin, where the earth was warm and deceptive. The locals, the ones who'd lived with the hot springs their whole lives, would say something else. The older line was the one the land wanted people to take, because that was where the heat came up and changed everything. Evan walked into thicker steam and vanished from the world in a way that looked, at first, like ordinary wilderness tragedy. His sister Mara was the first person to realize something was wrong. Mara lived 2 states away, but they talked often and they talked in patterns. Evan would always send a photo at the trailhead and then another one at the first cool thing. A weird mushroom, a stream, a rock that looked like a face if you squinted. On that day, Mara got the trailhead photo. She got nothing else. At first, she didn't panic. She worked, answered emails, did normal life. She sent Evan a message around midday. Hot springs yet? She got no response. She sent another later, joking about him becoming a forest hermit. No response. She reminded herself that cell service was bad. She reminded herself that Evan was fine. Then night came. Still nothing. By late evening, Mara's rational thoughts had begun to fray. She called Evan, straight to voicemail. She called again. Same. She called the number of the lodge in Clearwater where Evan had said he might grab dinner afterward. The receptionist said no one by that name had checked in. No one had asked for him. No one had left a message. Mara slept badly. When morning came, she called the county sheriff's office and said her brother was missing near the hot springs. The dispatcher asked when Evan was last seen. Mara said, yesterday morning. The dispatcher asked if Evan had a history of mental health issues, if he had threatened to harm himself, if he might have left voluntarily. Mara's jaw tightened. She answered no to everything because it was all wrong, because her brother wasn't a checkbox. He was a person who always packed a headlamp. That day, a ranger was sent to the trailhead lot. Evan's car was still there. That was the moment the story changed from unreachable hiker to missing person. Search and rescue came in waves the way storms do. At first it was local volunteers, people who knew the woods, who hunted elk, who fished the creeks. They searched the main trails, called Evan's name, listened for whistles. They found nothing but wet leaves and the uneasy quiet that grows when a search starts. Then it became more organized. Dogs, grid patterns, maps with colored lines. a command post set up in the parking lot under a pop-up tent. People with radios clipped to their shoulders, voices short and efficient. They searched the geothermal basin carefully because it was dangerous even for trained teams. The hot springs weren't just warm pools. There were vent cracks, mud pots, places where the ground could be thin enough to break under a person's weight. They used poles to test footing. They roped up in some sections like it was a climbing route, slow and methodical. They found a footprint in soft soil. They found a snapped twig. They found a candy wrapper. Nothing that proved it was Evan. Nothing that proved anything at all. The trail app logs from his phone didn't help much. The last reliable ping was near the spur trail entrance. After that, the signal drifted into nonsense. It made Evan look like he'd walked in circles into the creek, across a cliff, into a place that didn't exist. Mara drove in that afternoon, white-knuckled the whole way, and showed up at the command post with a face that wasn't crying yet, but wanted to. She spoke to the incident commander, a calm man named Lyle Brenner, who had the posture of someone who delivered bad news before and hated it every time. Lyle told her they were doing everything they could. Mara asked the question people always ask, even though the answer never sounds good. Do you think he's alive? Lyle didn't answer quickly. That pause alone felt like an injury. He said it depended. It depended on injuries, on weather, on water, on whether Evan had shelter, on whether he'd gotten stuck in terrain that kept him from moving, on whether he'd fallen into a vent or slipped into a hidden pool. It depended on a lot of things. The first week passed like that. Hope stretched tight, then loosened, then stretched again. They brought in a drone, but steam scrambled the view. The camera saw a white fog blanket that shifted like breath. They brought in a helicopter for an aerial sweep, but the canopy was thick and the terrain uneven. They brought in more dogs, and the dogs did what dogs do. They ran, they sniffed, they circled, and then they sat down and looked at their handlers with that frustrated confusion that says, the scent is there and not there. One dog tracked Evan's scent down toward the basin, and then lost it abruptly near a cluster of boulders, slick with mineral runoff. Another dog tracked it toward the ridge, and then lost it near a creek where the warm water met cold. The teams argued quietly about what that meant. One theory was simple. Evan slipped into a hot spring vent and was gone. Another theory was also simple but uglier. Evan didn't just slip. Someone took him. People hate that idea. Not because it's impossible, but because it makes the woods feel less neutral. It turns a missing hiker into a crime scene. It means you can't just blame bad luck and geography. It means there's an intention out there. Mara didn't know which theory she hated more. After 2 weeks, the official search scaled back. Not because they didn't care, but because resources are finite and reality is cruel. Volunteers still walked the trails. Mara refused to leave. She put up flyers in every diner, every gas station, every grocery store. She learned the names of the rangers. She learned the names of the volunteers who came every weekend to search, even when the official command post was gone. She learned the landscape the way grieving people learn anything. Too quickly, too deeply. She learned where the steam rose strongest at dawn. She learned which pools looked safe, but weren't. She learned the sound of her own voice calling Evan's name until it felt like it belonged to someone else. Then time did what it always does. It moved. It kept moving. It dragged everyone with it. Months later, after summer shifted toward a cooler season, a man named Orrin Pike found the backpack. Oren wasn't part of the official search. He was a local who hunted mushrooms and sold them to restaurants and pretended it wasn't a weird job. He walked the woods like they were his backyard. He didn't go to the main hot springs because he hated crowds, but he did wander the edges of the geothermal basin because certain mushrooms liked the warm ground. He knew the spur trails. He knew the unofficial paths. He knew which trees lightning hit most often. On that day, Oren was following a shallow ravine where the air smelled sweet and rotten at the same time, the way warm, wet earth can smell. He looked up because something pale caught his eye between branches. At first he thought it was a bird nest. Then he realized it was a backpack. It hung high in a tree, not caught on a branch like it had been thrown, but suspended, hanging, strapped around a thick limb as if someone had deliberately looped it there. It was several yards off the ground, higher than Oren could reach without climbing. He stood there for a long time looking up, the way people stare at a car crash because their brains can't immediately file what they're seeing. Backpacks don't climb trees. Not like that. Oren's first thought was that someone had tried to stash gear. Hikers do that sometimes, leave a pack while they explore a side area, hoping animals won't get into it. But the height was unusual, almost theatrical, and this wasn't some hidden backcountry stash. This was near the hot springs, in an area that had been searched. His second thought came with a chill. Evan, Oren climbed. He wasn't a professional climber, but he knew trees. He moved slowly, using knots in bark, testing branches like he tested mushrooms. When he reached the limb, he unhooked the backpack and lowered it carefully with a rope he kept in his pack for hauling. When the backpack hit the ground, Oren stepped back as if it might bite him. It looked older than it should have, weathered and mineral stained, but not destroyed. The fabric was stiff in places. The straps had streaks like dried salt. There were scratches like it had been dragged over rock, but the pack wasn't torn apart. It wasn't chewed. It wasn't moldy the way a pack left on the forest floor would be. It had been protected, kept off the ground, kept from animals, kept. Oren didn't open it right away. He sat down on a rock and stared at it. And then he did what people do when they're holding something that feels too big to own alone. He called the ranger station. Within an hour, Lyle Brenner and two deputies were standing in the ravine, looking up at the tree, looking down at the backpack, their faces tight with something between relief and dread. News traveled fast because missing person stories become community myths. The backpack was the first tangible thing connected to Evan in months. It was the first object that could be pointed at, the first piece of proof that he had been there and maybe had left something behind. Mara got the call while she was back home, trying to return to a life that still felt like a costume. She drove through the night, again. At the ranger station, Lyle laid the backpack on a table like evidence, because that's what it was now. Someone took photos from every angle. Someone recorded the condition, the location, the height it had hung. Mara stood on the other side of the table, hands clenched, trying not to shake. She wanted to touch it like it was Evan's shoulder. She also didn't want to touch it at all because touching it would make it real. Lyle told her they had to open it carefully. They had to document everything. He asked if she wanted to be present. Mara said yes because she couldn't imagine not watching. A deputy unzipped the main compartment. The smell that rose from inside wasn't rot. It wasn't death. It was mineral and damp fabric and something faintly metallic, like wet stone. Inside, the first things were ordinary. A water bottle, empty. A headlamp which made Mara's heart sting because Evan always packed one. A small pack of trail mix, unopened. A folded rain shell. Then beneath those items, wrapped in a plastic bag, was a notebook. Not a fancy journal. A cheap, spiral-bound pad, the kind you buy at a grocery store because you forgot you needed one. The notebook was dry. Not just mostly dry. Dry like it had never been in a wet forest. Dry like it had been kept somewhere sheltered or sealed or hung in a tree. Mara's throat tightened. Lyle stared at the notebook longer than he should have. He had seen all kinds of strange things in searches. Shoes, hats, half-torn clothing, broken phones, a dry notebook in a weathered backpack. Didn't fit the usual story. A deputy opened it carefully. The first pages were blank. Then about a third of the way in, there was writing. Not a diary, not emotional confession. Notes. Short, urgent lines, directions, observations. Mara leaned forward, reading as the deputy turned pages. The writing was Evan's. She knew it immediately. Evan had a neat, blocky script, the kind that looks like someone who made their handwriting legible on purpose. The first note that made everyone go quiet was not dramatic. It was practical. Steam hides sound, don't trust it. The next, not alone out here. And then, on another page, if you find this, don't follow the main pools. Under that, a rough sketch, a ridge line, a bend in a creek, a mark that looked like a tree and a rock. And then, backpack hung on purpose. Look up. Mara felt her stomach drop. The backpack wasn't an accident. Evan had planned it, which meant Evan had been alive long enough to do something deliberate, which raised the question that clawed at everyone's thoughts. Alive where? The notebook continued. There were notes about warmth in certain cracks in the rock, about a smell that got stronger near a particular slope. There were notes about a service path and old pipe. There were notes about hearing footsteps that didn't sound like animals. And then, on a page near the end, a line that felt like a door opening. Hospital tag. Mara frowned. Lyle's eyebrows moved in a way that said he noticed it too. Hospital tag didn't belong in a hot springs hiking story. Unless it did. Unless the hot springs weren't just hot springs. The Clearwater area had history, old facilities, old legends. There had been a resort in the early 20th century built around the hot springs. People came for healing and left with stories. There had been fires, closures, bankruptcies. Parts of the old resort were still out there in the woods. Rotting foundations, broken tile, rusted railings half buried in moss. Lyle had walked those ruins before. Most locals had. Teenagers dared each other to go at night, to take photos, to prove they weren't scared. Mara had never cared about any of that. Now the words hospital tag sat in her mind like a cold stone. They went back to the backpack. In the front pocket, beneath a crumpled map, they found a plastic bracelet, a hospital wristband. It was old, yellowed, the adhesive softened with age. The printed text was mostly smeared, but a few marks remained, enough to confirm it had been real, not a costume prank. Mara's lips parted. Her mind tried to build a story that made sense. Why would Evan have a hospital wristband in the woods? Unless he found it, unless it was part of a place, unless he had been inside something. Inside what? Lyle made a decision then, one that would be criticized by some and quietly praised by others. He reopened the search, not broadly, Not the whole forest again, but targeted, focused on the clues in the notebook. He organized a small team with people he trusted, experienced searchers, a few volunteers who knew the geothermal basin intimately, and one older man named Hal Calder, a former maintenance worker who had once been employed at the old hot springs resort, back when it was still limping along as a wellness retreat. Hal was the kind of man who carried keys long after the locks had changed. He said he knew the old service paths. He said there were pipes and tunnels in that area people forgot about. He said if Evan had stumbled into one of those, it could explain why the search missed him. Mara went with them because she refused to stay behind and wonder. They followed Evan's sketch. They avoided the main pools. They took a lesser path that climbed above the steam basin. The air grew heavier with mineral smell. The trees thinned in patches where the ground was warm. The forest floor had strange bare spots where nothing grew, like the earth itself was too hot to support life. They reached a creek bend where the water ran oddly warm on one side and cold on the other, as if two worlds were meeting. Hal stopped and pointed at a cluster of rocks. He said there used to be an intake pipe there, a line that fed water to the old resort bathhouse. It had been capped decades ago, but the pipe was probably still present underground. They found it. A rusted metal circle partly hidden by moss. It looked like an old manhole cover, but smaller, and off to the side where no official trail would ever go. Lyle signaled the team to stop. They tested the air, they listened, they checked for unstable ground. Then they pried the cap loose. Warm air rose from beneath, carrying a stronger smell, mineral, damp, and something else, faintly chemical like old disinfectant. Mara's skin prickled. A ladder ran down into darkness. Hal said quietly that this was part of the old service network. Workers used it to access valves and drains. It wasn't meant for guests. It wasn't on maps. Lyle lowered a light. The ladder descended into a narrow tunnel with concrete walls stained by years of water and heat. Pipes ran along the ceiling. The air down there was warmer, humid. Sound changed. It became muffled as if the earth was swallowing it. Mara's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. They went down. The tunnel stretched into darkness. Their lights caught old warning signs, mostly unreadable now. They passed a junction where the tunnel split. Hal chose left, saying it would lead toward the old bathhouse foundation. They walked carefully, stepping around puddles that reflected their lights like black mirrors. The tunnel began to slope upward. The smell of mineral water grew stronger. The air felt alive, moving in pulses, as if the springs were breathing through the concrete. Then ahead they saw something that made them stop. A strip of bright fabric tied around a pipe. It was not old, not mossy, not faded. It looked like a piece of Evan's rain shell. Mara's breath hitched. They moved faster now, still careful, but urgency in their bodies. The tunnel opened into a larger room, an old mechanical chamber, rusted valves, broken gauges, a concrete floor with cracks that steamed faintly at the edges. There were shelves against one wall, mostly empty, but on the floor beneath them was a pile of items. A blanket, an empty food wrapper, a crushed plastic bottle, and a small pile of stones arranged in a line like markers. Someone had been here, recently enough that the items hadn't been swallowed by mold. Mara stumbled forward, scanning, desperate for the shape of her brother. And then she saw it. A note scratched into dust on a shelf. Not carved, not permanent, just written with a finger into a thick layer of grime. Up, Lyle's gaze followed the direction instinctively. In the ceiling there was a vent opening half covered by a metal grate. The grate had been loosened, not removed entirely, but shifted. Hal muttered that this vent connected to the surface. It might open near one of the old ruins. Mara's stomach twisted. If Evan had climbed up through that vent, he could have gotten out without leaving obvious tracks. He could have hidden. He could have moved in ways the searchers never expected, or someone else could have moved him. They climbed. The vent tunnel was cramped, hot, the air thick and wet. They moved in slow, careful inches until the tunnel ended at a heavy grate. Lyle pushed. The grate lifted with a groan. Daylight poured in. They emerged beneath a collapsed wooden structure, old beams and rotting planks, the foundation of the old bathhouse, hidden from the main trail by trees and steam. Mara looked around, dizzy. Then she saw another marker, a stack of stones by a fallen log, arranged in a pattern that looked intentional. An arrow, crude but clear. They followed it. The path led through thicker brush, around the edge of a steaming fissure toward a stand of tall pines on higher ground, and then abruptly they heard something they hadn't heard in months, a human sound. Not a bird, not wind, not the hiss of steam. A weak, strained whistle. Mara froze because her brain didn't trust it. Hope is dangerous. Hope can make you hallucinate. The whistle came again. Lyle raised his hand, silencing the team. He called out. No response, but the whistle came again, closer now, followed by a hoarse sound that could have been a word. They moved. They pushed through brush and found a narrow depression in the ground, like a shallow cave entrance hidden behind roots. Hal crouched and shone a light inside. Mara saw a shape, a person, curled under a blanket, eyes reflecting light like an animal's at first, then blinking slowly, painfully trying to focus. Evan. He was thinner. His face was hollowed, his lips cracked, but he was there, alive. Mara made a sound that was half sob and half laugh and half prayer. She dropped to her knees, reaching, and then stopped herself because she didn't know if he was injured, because she didn't want to hurt him. Evan's eyes met hers. He tried to speak. His voice was a dry rasp. Mara heard her name, barely. Lyle took over then, because survival rescues have a rhythm. They assessed. They stabilized. They gave water carefully, small sips. They checked for fractures, for infection, for hypothermia that can still happen even near hot springs, because sweat and steam and cold air are a nasty combination. Evan's hands trembled when he drank. Mara held his wrist gently, as if grounding him in reality. The team moved him slowly, carefully toward a place where they could lift him out safely. A stretcher, a call to paramedics, radios crackling with urgency that sounded almost joyful. Evan's return should have been the end of the mystery. It wasn't. Because once Evan was safe enough to talk, once his voice returned and his eyes looked less like survival mirrors and more like himself, he told them a story that made the hair rise on Mara's arms. He hadn't fallen. He hadn't simply gotten lost and wandered into a tunnel by accident. He had been followed. It started, he said, with the feeling that the forest behind him was organized. He described it awkwardly at first, as if he knew it sounded dramatic. The sense that footsteps were matching his pace. The sense that when he stopped, the other sound stopped. The sense that when steam rolled through the trees, it rolled at exactly the wrong moment, like someone was using it. Evan said he tried to dismiss it. He tried to tell himself it was paranoia, that the forest makes tricks of sound, but then he saw someone. not on the main trail, on the spur, where nobody should have been. A man in dark clothes, not dressed like a hiker, no visible pack, no trekking poles, just standing in the steam, watching. Evan didn't approach. He walked faster. He said he reached the area near the old resort ruins and saw something else that snapped the moment into reality. An open door. Not a natural opening. A doorway in the collapsed bathhouse foundation, hidden by brush. And from inside, a flicker of light. Evan admitted he should have turned back immediately. He admitted curiosity was his weakness. He got closer. He saw a man carry something into the doorway. A heavy metal case, the kind you might see in a lab or a medical facility. Evan's mind connected old resort to old clinic, to the stories he'd read, people coming for healing, weird rumors about private retreats that still happened out there for certain clients. It felt like a weird backwoods secret business. He should have left. Instead, he pulled out his phone and took a photo. The flash was off, but his screen lit his face for a second. That glow, Evan said, was enough. Someone turned sharply. Someone saw him. Evan ran. He heard footsteps behind him. He heard voices, low and urgent, not panicked, angry. He ran downhill toward the creek because he knew water and noise could break pursuit. He slipped once in slick mineral mud and caught himself, tearing his palm. He kept moving, lungs burning. He reached the capped access pipe area without knowing what it was. He simply saw a rusted cover and remembered something he'd read long ago about resorts having service tunnels. He pried it open in desperation because the footsteps behind him were close enough that the steam couldn't hide them. He went down the ladder with his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break ribs. In the tunnel, he heard the sound of someone above, the scrape of boots on metal. Evan ran through the tunnel blindly until he hit the mechanical chamber, until he found the vent that led upward, until he climbed into the old bathhouse foundation and crawled out into daylight like a human animal. He thought he was safe. Then he saw the man again, higher up on the ridge, watching the ruins like he owned them. Evan realized the worst part. The man wasn't searching randomly. He knew the area. He knew the tunnels. He knew the exits. Evan hid. He moved in short bursts, staying low using steam plumes as cover. But now the steam didn't feel neutral. It felt like a curtain someone else controlled. At some point, Evan realized his phone was almost dead, and he had no service. He realized he couldn't call for help. He realized he couldn't lead whoever was following him back toward the main pools without putting other hikers at risk. So he did something that sounded simple but required a kind of calm panic. He decided to leave evidence. He said he wrote in the notebook because he needed his thoughts to stay straight. He said he wrote warnings because if he didn't make it out, he wanted someone else to understand what was happening. He hid in the tunnel chamber for stretches of time, listening. Sometimes he heard movement above. Sometimes he heard the clang of metal like someone opening and closing something heavy. Sometimes he heard nothing at all, which was worse. He ran out of food quickly. He drank water where he could, sometimes from the creek, sometimes from condensation he collected near vents. He said the warm air kept him from freezing, but it also kept him damp, always damp, the kind of damp that makes your skin feel like it belongs to the cave. He said the strangest part was finding the wristband. He found it in the tunnel chamber, wedged behind a shelf, as if someone had shoved it there long ago. It wasn't his. He didn't know whose it was. but it told him something that felt like confirmation. This place had been used, not just for pipes, for people. He said he kept the wristband because he couldn't explain it, but he couldn't ignore it either. He said it made him feel like he wasn't the first to vanish near the breathers. When Mara heard that, she felt sick. Not because Evan was alive, thank God he was alive, but because the hot springs story now had a darker underside, a second layer. Lyle listened to Evan's story with a face that stayed controlled, but his eyes sharpened. He asked careful questions, the way law enforcement does when they're trying to separate adrenaline from fact. Evan couldn't describe the man perfectly. Steam and fear do that. They blur faces, but he described enough. Height, build, the way the man moved with confidence, the lack of hiking gear, the sense that he was not lost at all. Then Evan said the line that made everyone go very still. He said he saw a second person, briefly, near the ruins. Someone in a white coat, not medical scrubs, not a nurse uniform. A white coat like a technician. And the technician carried a clipboard. It sounded almost absurd. A white coat in the woods near hot springs, like a lab scene accidentally dropped into a hiking story. But the hot springs weren't just a scenic place. They were geothermal. They were chemistry and heat and earth pressure. They were valuable, and valuable places attract people who want them for more than soaking. Evan said, while hiding one night near the tunnel exit, he heard a conversation through the steam. He couldn't make out all words, but he heard enough to remember two phrases, ward and log. He didn't know what they meant then. He only knew they didn't belong. Months later, when the backpack was found hanging in the tree, it wasn't because Evan had simply forgotten it. Evan said he hung it deliberately the first time he realized he might not survive. He climbed the tree because the ground was too active, too full of animals and water and mud. He needed the notebook to stay dry. He needed his pack to stay out of reach. He needed it to wait. He wrote, "Look up" in the notebook because he didn't trust anyone to think to look into trees. And then he left the backpack there and vanished into the tunnels again, hoping the pack would outlive him. It did. That part of the story became the neat ending people wanted. Evan survived, left clues, was rescued. But the other part, the part about the man and the white coat and the words ward and log, refused to settle. Lyle kept the details quiet at first. He didn't want to launch a panic without evidence. He also didn't want to spook whoever might be using the ruins, because now he couldn't pretend it was only wilderness. He secured the tunnel access point. He ordered surveillance near the ruins. He asked state investigators to quietly check the history of the old resort property, ownership records, permits, any recent requests for geothermal testing. And he asked something else, something that sounded paranoid until it didn't. He asked the hospital in Clearwater if they had any connection to the old resort clinic. The hospital administrator told him the resort had been private, that records were incomplete, that it wasn't their responsibility. Lyle asked anyway if any old logs existed. The administrator asked why. Lyle didn't answer with drama. He answered with the flat truth. Because a missing man came out of a tunnel with a hospital wristband and notes about a ward. There was a pause on the phone that felt like a door quietly closing. Then the administrator said there were no such logs. That no sounded too fast. Mara, meanwhile, sat beside Evan's hospital bed and watched him sleep. He slept like someone still half in the tunnel, muscles twitching, face tense. When he woke, He flinched at small sounds, at the beep of medical machines, at footsteps in hallways. He was alive, but his nervous system had not gotten the memo. Mara wanted to focus on his recovery. She wanted the story to end. She wanted to close the book, hug her brother, and go home. But when Evan looked at her with those same steady eyes and asked if she believed him about the man, Mara answered yes, without hesitation. Because Evan wasn't a liar. He wasn't a storyteller. He didn't exaggerate for attention. He barely used social media. He hiked because he liked quiet. If Evan said someone was out there, someone was out there. Weeks later, Lyle and a small team returned to the old bathhouse foundation in daylight with equipment. They documented the tunnel system. They photographed the mechanical chamber. They collected the wristband with proper evidence procedures. They searched for any sign of recent use, fresh footprints, cigarette butts, tool marks. They found something, a metal case, not hidden deeply, just tucked behind a collapsed beam under a tarp, like someone meant to retrieve it. Inside the case were vials and instruments, the kind used for sampling water. The labels were blank. No company name, no medical branding, just tools, and one worn laminated card with a symbol that looked like a simplified heat map. Not a cult symbol, not a creepy rune, something technical. It wasn't enough to name a suspect, but it was enough to prove Evan hadn't imagined everything. The next clue came from someone unexpected. Hal Calder. Hal showed up at the ranger station one evening with a face like he'd swallowed something bitter. He said he'd been thinking about the tunnels. He said he'd been thinking about that word Evan mentioned, log. Hal said the old resort used to have a ledger kept in a locked cabinet in the maintenance office, detailing who accessed which tunnels and when, because the resort had to track workers after a guest once wandered into a service corridor and nearly got burned by steam. Hal said that ledger was never turned over when the resort closed. It vanished. Lyle asked why Hal never mentioned it earlier. Hal looked away. He admitted he didn't think it mattered. He admitted he didn't want to get involved in old nonsense. He admitted that when you live near a place like the Breathers long enough, you learn to mind your business. Lyle asked if Hal knew where the maintenance office was. Hal said yes. They went. The maintenance office wasn't a building anymore, not really. It was a rotted structure half collapsed into brush, with a concrete foundation that still held its shape. Under the foundation, Hal said, there used to be a locked storage space, a crawl space. They pried boards. They moved debris. They crawled into a damp pocket beneath the foundation, and there, wrapped in plastic and tucked behind an old toolbox, was a book, a log. It was not a hospital log. It was a resort maintenance log, but the pages had notes that made Lyle's jaw tighten. Access entries, names, mostly initials, dates from decades ago, and then, oddly, recent marks. Not many, but enough. Someone had been using the tunnels again, someone with keys. Hal swore he hadn't been down there in years. Lyle believed him. Hal's fear was too genuine. The recent entries were written in a different ink, a different hand. They listed tunnel access near the bathhouse foundation. They listed ward once, scribbled in the margin like shorthand. It wasn't proof of a secret hospital. It was proof that someone used the language of wards to describe something in those tunnels. Something organized, something controlled. Lyle escalated the case. It became more than a missing hiker. It became an investigation into illegal geothermal access, trespassing, and potentially, depending on what those white coat people were doing, something bigger. The story reached the state level, but it didn't explode into headlines the way Mara expected. Instead, it moved quietly, like bureaucracy often does. Investigators interviewed people. They checked permits. They looked for contractors who might have reasons to sample hot springs. They looked at property ownership of the old resort land and discovered a string of shell companies that led to nothing clear. A dead end designed to be a dead end. Some people in town scoffed and said it was just hobby scientists. Some said it was a private wellness group. Some said it was criminals hiding things where nobody looked. Mara stopped listening to theories. She focused on Evan. Evan recovered slowly. He spent time in therapy. He learned how to sleep in a room without feeling trapped. He learned how to walk past steam in a morning shower without his stomach dropping. He told his story to investigators again and again, and each time he told it, he grew more certain about one detail he hadn't been certain about at first. The man in the woods had not been surprised to see him. The man had been angry, like Evan had walked into a place where he wasn't allowed to look. That meant it wasn't random. It meant the hot springs held a secret someone valued. The final twist of the story did not come from a dramatic arrest or a chase in the woods. It came from the backpack, because while the notebook had given them a trail, the backpack itself had another quiet detail that nobody noticed until later. A knot. The strap had been looped around the tree limb in a particular way. Not a simple wrap, not a random tie. A proper arborist knot. The kind used by trail maintenance crews when they hang gear. Lyle sent photos of the knot to a friend in forestry. The friend confirmed it. Whoever hung that pack knew rope work, knew how to secure weight, how to keep a pack from slipping, how to keep it stable in wind. That narrowed the list of possible backpack hangers dramatically. Evan said he had hung it himself. That was true, but Evan was not trained in arborist work. He was a hiker, not a rope technician. Lyle asked Evan to demonstrate the knot he thought he'd used. Evan tried. His hands shook from memory. He couldn't replicate it. That didn't mean Evan was lying. It meant something else. Maybe Evan had looped the strap clumsily, and someone else, someone who found the pack before Oren did, had re-secured it properly, had adjusted it, had ensured it stayed in place. Someone who knew rope. Someone who also conveniently knew the trails and the tunnels. Lyle went through trail maintenance records. One name surfaced repeatedly. A contractor who worked seasonal hazard tree removal near the hot springs area. A man who had access to the old resort land through maintenance agreements that were vaguely worded and rarely checked. The man was not a villain in the obvious way. He lived nearby. He had a family. He showed up to town events. He had a reputation for being helpful, which is always the part that makes your skin crawl later. Investigators questioned him. He denied everything. He said he hadn't been near the hot springs recently. He said he didn't know about tunnels. He said he had never seen Evan. Then they asked about the sampling case found under the beam. The man's eyes shifted just slightly. Not a confession, just a human leak. He said he had done private work in the area for a client, something about assessing mineral water quality. Investigators asked the client's name. He refused. He said confidentiality. They asked why a private water quality assessment would involve sealed tunnels and secret access logs. He insisted the tunnels were just old structures. He insisted it was harmless. He insisted. And then, under pressure, he made the mistake people make when they're trying to keep a story straight. He said nobody could get into those tunnels anymore. Lyle asked how he knew that. The man realized too late what he'd said, because only someone who had tried to get in, or successfully gotten in, would speak with that kind of certainty. The case didn't end with a clean, cinematic bow. Life rarely does. The man eventually admitted he had been paid to escort a research team to the old resort area. He said he didn't ask questions. He said they wore white coats because they wanted to look official, because official-looking people get less challenged. He said they were taking samples and mapping heat vents. He said they warned him that the area was dangerous and that hikers would be a problem. When Evan appeared, the escort panicked. He chased Evan to scare him off. He said he didn't mean to harm him. He said he lost Evan in the steam and assumed Evan had fallen somewhere. He said he didn't report it because he feared liability. It was cowardice, he claimed, not malice. Investigators didn't accept that as a moral excuse. The research team was harder to identify. They were a group operating under a private label, with paperwork that looked legitimate until you followed it and found it dissolved into nothing. They were not ghosts, but they had built their work like ghosts, temporary, mobile, careful. Their interest appeared to be geothermal, mineral rights, something valuable enough to make secrecy worth it. In the end, the county fenced off parts of the old resort ruins and formally sealed the tunnel access, this time with real locks and monitored entry. They posted warnings, they did official surveys, they made a public statement about unsafe historical structures and unauthorized access. It sounded like a safety memo. Corresponding to people who lived there, it sounded like something else. It sounded like, finally, someone admitting that the breathers weren't just a pretty place to soak. They were a place where secrets could hide under steam. Evan moved back home with Mara for a while. He gained weight again. His eyes stopped scanning every doorway. He returned to hiking eventually, but he chose drier trails, higher ridges, places where the ground didn't exhale. Once, months after everything, Mara asked Evan why he wrote those notes instead of just trying to run all the way to the main pools. Evan looked at her for a long time before answering. He said he didn't want other people pulled into whatever was happening out there. He said the steam made him realize how easy it is to vanish in a place that muffles sound and distorts vision. He said he kept thinking, if I disappear here, it will look like the land did it. And maybe the land would get blamed again like it always does, while the real reason stayed hidden. So he wrote. He left breadcrumbs. He hung the backpack. He made sure the story couldn't be buried quietly. The last image Mara kept from that period wasn't the backpack in the tree or the tunnel or the old wristband. It was the moment Evan stepped out of the forest during the rescue, thin, shaking, alive, and looked back once toward the steam basin. His face wasn't relieved. Not exactly. It was wary, like a man who had learned something about a place that most people never learn, that a beautiful landscape can be two things at once, a refuge and a hiding place.